Coming to you now, it's Long Waves with Gary Krug. And I need to say right here at the beginning of the show that the opinions expressed on Long Waves are solely my own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of KYRS, its staff, management, or underwriters. So thank you so much for joining me today. This is a slight departure from the sorts of shows I've been doing, but perhaps not. I don't know. I wanted to talk today about the climate of violence in America, and particularly some aspects of the climate of violence. This will be an adult theme, so it may not be suitable for young children, because we are going to talk about sexual violence, among other things. So if that's an issue for you, catch it on the podcast. Anyway, you've been warned. I wanted to start with some reflections on Emma Sulkowicz's new project. Now, for those of you who don't remember the name Emma Sulkowicz, she was a student at Columbia University who was raped, she says, and she tried to get it investigated, tried to bring charges. The university dismissed it, said it wasn't that, and there were some other issues there as well. But she, for a while, carried around a mattress with her as a protest, and even carried it to graduation, I understand. It was called the Carry That Weight campaign. Well, I understand how she would want to bring attention to issues of sexual violence. It's important that we do this. And she has a new project now, which is a new website, which is to instigate some thought and discussion about sexual violence. And her take is rather interesting because she throws it back on the viewer, the person watching the website, looking at the website. The website is called Ceci n'est pas un viol, and it's a play, of course, on Magritte's Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe, and she has it, this is not rape. She begins the site with a trigger warning, and she says, the following text contains allusions to rape. Everything that takes place in the following video is consensual, but may resemble rape. It is not a reenactment, but may seem like one. If at any point you are triggered or upset, please proceed with caution and or exit this website. However, I do not mean to be prescriptive, for many people find pleasure in feeling upset. And she goes on to say, this is not about one night in August 2012. It's about your decisions starting now. It's only a reenactment if you disregard my words. It's about you, not him. Do not watch this video if your motives would upset me. My desires are unclear to you, or my nuances are indecipherable. You might be wondering why I've made myself this vulnerable. Look, I want to change the world, and that begins with you seeing yourself. If you watch this video without my consent, then I would hope you would reflect on your reasons for objectifying me and participating in my rape. For in that case, you were the one who couldn't resist the urge to make Ceci n'est pas un viol about what you wanted to make it about. Rape. Please don't participate in my rape. Watch kindly. That's an intriguing confrontation of the viewer on the website. So then she begins to ask some very directive questions. For example, are you searching for proof? Proof of what? Are you searching for ways to either hurt or help me? What are you looking for on this site? Do you desire pleasure? Do you desire revulsion? Is this to counteract your unconscious enjoyment? What do you want from this experience? How well do you think you know me? Have we ever met? Do you think I'm the perfect victim or the world's worst victim? Do you refuse to see me either as a human being or a victim? If so, why? Is it to deny me agency and thus further victimize me? If so, what do you think of the fact that you owe your ability to do so to me, since I'm the one who took the risk and made myself vulnerable in the first place? That's an interesting question to ask. What do you think of the fact that you owe your ability to victimize her, again, since she's the one who took the risk and made her vulnerable in the first place? And this is really her contention in the video, which is very graphic, and also in her discussion of her assault back in 2012. Her final question is, do you hate me? If so, how does it feel to hate me? And I like very much that project of turning it back to the audience, turning it back to the world, because whenever there's an assault, the tendency of much of the culture and much of society is to focus on the victims, who blame the victim, to shame the victim, the whole slut-shaming thing that goes on, where, what were you wearing, why were you there, didn't you know better, how can you consent to sex and then have it suddenly become unconsensual, and all of this goes back to some flaw of the person who's been raped or assaulted. It goes back to trying to blame them for it, to focus it on them, when indeed, she's quite right. We need to focus on ourselves and engage some questions. So that's what I'm going to try to do here today in some discussions of this whole issue and some of the current thinking on why we're such a rapey culture, and we are, why there's so much violence, and why we have the particular kinds of masculinity in this culture that we have. The stats are grim. I mean, when you get into them, the stats are grim about how many people are assaulted, how many people are raped. And the official stats are considerably underreporting, because about 85% of rape victims don't report to criminal justice authorities. And of the 15% who do report, maybe 10% result in the filing of charges, and perhaps 40% of those cases result in some kind of conviction. So there's a very low reporting and a very low conviction rate for a lot of reasons on sexual assault. But if you look at how common it is, the official numbers are remarkably stupid. Not even close. The unofficial numbers are much more interesting, because it turns out that if you ask men things that, if you ask men questions about their behavior and don't frame it as rape or assault, and it's an anonymous report, they tend to report much higher numbers. So if one extrapolates on that data, and there's good evidence that this is a meaningful way to do it, David Lezak, a PhD and a psychology professor in Boston, reports that as of 2002, 14.8% of women were victims of rape at some point during their lifetime. 14.8. 2.8% of women were victims of attempted rape at some point in their life. And about 0.3% of women were victims of rape during the previous 12 months, which gives you about an 8.7 per 1,000 incidence rate. So he extrapolates this into Boston, and the official statistics for 1998 said that there were 1,687 rapes reported in all of Massachusetts and 526 arrests made. In that same year, among the approximately 1.75 million women in the Boston metro area, according to the extrapolations, there were not 1,687 rapes. There were 15,225. And Lezak here is not citing numbers of men assaulted. He's not citing numbers of children assaulted. This is just women. So there is this remarkable prevalence of sexual assault going on in this country all around us all the time. It's really as American as apple pie. We heard recently, just last year, over in Missoula about the problems with the football team and the amount of sexual assault that was going on there. And according to the local police, there were about 88 rapes reported over 3 years, which is about average for reporting. But again, those figures are going to be much, much higher. Those are just the ones people actually go and report. And remember, 85% of victims never even report it. So we can take that 88, divide it by 3, and come up with a somewhat smaller number, let's say around 23. And let's multiply that then by 85, and then we're getting closer to our real number of how many rapes are occurring. So what the heck is going on? The big focus lately has been on campus rape. And campus rape is this newfangled category that they've come up with. It's kind of like real rape, that Republicans talked about. But campus rape. And it fits in nicely with the other new categories that we talk about. So there's date rape, or sometimes called relationship rape. And the thing about these is whatever modifier you put in front of the word rape does not change the word rape. But there is a connotation that's carried along with the word date or relationship, or even with recognizing that over 90% of the victims of sexual assault knew their assailant. And there's this idea that somehow, it's not really that big a deal. It's just a little misunderstanding, and they were both drinking. Maybe they're both to blame, and blah, 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 blah. And in point of fact, society just doesn't have a clear language in which to speak to the reality of the social interactions of assault. It's a nettle we will not grasp. So law, can only deal with it in its very constrained way. The customs and the histories of how we deal with these things are generally to sweep them under the rug wherever possible, especially if you're an institution. Minimize the numbers. And not all institutions do this, but some do. And now there's a lot of Title IX pressure in the university world, which is forcing them to look at the numbers and take them much, much more seriously and be much more proactive. But the other thing we never really examine are the dynamics of social power. We never examine those dynamics of social power, and especially what powers are men presumed to be able to wield and what powers do women supposedly have. Well, anyway you look at that, you can see it's a pretty uneven dynamic in terms of power. In terms of economic power, in terms of physical power, in terms of social status, men are consistently on the high side of these things in this culture. And colleges are kind of target-rich environments for rapists. They truly are. Here you have a lot of young people away from home for the first time, probably, living quasi like adults. They don't have much training or experience in doing that. They're often using large amounts of alcohol and are encouraged to do this. There are a lot of peer pressures to go to parties, to drink. There are a lot of peer pressures to have sex. There are a lot of other social pressures that encourage people to establish certain kinds of social arrangements, like sororities with fraternities, and go to each other's parties. So this is a situation that men who rape other people look for as good hunting grounds, really. And you notice how I'm shifting this so that I'm not talking about, some frat boy getting a little too drunk and Mary Lou getting a little too drunk and did they consent, did she not, whatever. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about another thing altogether, which is a kind of predatory sexual assault. And there's a reason I'm talking about that, but I'll get to that in a minute. First, I really have to look at why all this sexual violence. Why all of this sexual violence? I mean, if you think 1 in 4, maybe 1 in 5 women sexually assaulted in her life, you think 1 in 6 to up to maybe 1 in 20 men sexually assaulted in his life, in their lives. This is an epidemic. This is one of the great hidden epidemics of this culture. And overwhelmingly, stupidly overwhelmingly, men are the perpetrators. Now, when we dive into looking at that, we have to start asking questions about what's going on here. Why is it that men do these kinds of things? Well, there's a lot of evidence out there that shows that we're not doing a good job raising children, men or women. We're not at all. And with men, we raise men to be tough. We raise men to suppress their feelings, to repress their feelings. We raise men to have this ambiguous relationship with women. We raise men in a culture of not examining themselves and thinking about themselves and what they're actually doing and why. And we abuse our children and neglect them horribly. Horribly. I mean, men are indeed fascinated and threatened by women, but men are also threatened by other men. And the threat that men have for other men is quite different from the threat that men feel from women. And with women, it's a kind of emotional threat, or a kind of I don't know what to do here, because we don't train men very well to understand emotionality. But the kinds of threats, the kind of things that threaten men from other men are things generally having to do with status, or with the ever-present threat of violence, or indeed with the masculinity itself. You're not man enough. And because the emotions and the impulses and the fears and the pains and the uncertainties are unexamined, they remain unconscious. They take form in various kinds of attractions and thoughts and vague moods, all of the expressions of the things in our head that we never become aware of, the unconscious. That is the things men don't want to be aware of. So these feelings and impulses and vague moods end up repressed, but of course you can't keep things repressed for very long. They bubble up. As Carl Jung said, you can throw nature out with the pitchfork, but she always comes back again. And that's very much the case here. These things bubble up. They emerge in alien forms of fantasies, or intense feelings, or in various forms of acting out that arise from those feelings. Now, it would be best that men learn something of themselves. But alas, too many men have learned and continue to learn not to become self-aware. They're like Achilles in Ilium. He feels things in his chest and is moved to act, but at no point does he stop and reflect and think. We learn this in childhood. There are a lot of damaged people out there. We are not doing well. We have female children being sexualized almost from the time they pop from the womb. And I'm not even going into the toddlers with tiaras stuff, but Bratz and Barbie are enough. Truly. And with guys, it's guns and toughness and violence and acting out and being strong, being a man. We see the evidence of this in the fantasies of men, especially in pornography. Because pornography is it's overwhelmingly, it's men who enjoy pornography. Which is not to say some women don't. But it's interesting the role that pornography plays in men's fantasies, which has been well documented, and men will talk about it pretty commonly. So they have these fantasies, but which they could use to look at and go, why do I want that? What am I angry about here? Who am I seeing in this violent pornography? Who is this person? What is this experience that I keep coming back to? And why do I keep coming back to it? That would be an interesting place for people to gain some self-knowledge about themselves. For people to get some self-understanding and begin to work through, why am I angry? Why am I hurt? But many, if not most men, will use it instead to fuel and to reinforce their ideas and feelings and imagine various scenarios in which these sorts of things might play out. Violence begets violence. Which brings me to talking about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that was done by the CDC, which looked at about 17,000 people, which is a nice big sample size, 17,337. And specifically, they were looking at problems people have now in their lives and problems that people had as children. So if you start looking at people who have alcoholism, alcohol abuse, COPD, which is linked with smoking, depression, fetal death, quality of life, extensive illicit drug use, ischemic heart disease, liver disease associated with drinking again, intimate partner violence, multiple sexual partners, sexually transmitted infections, smoking, suicide attempts, unintended pregnancy, precocious sexual activity, adolescent pregnancies, all of these things. You take all of these kinds of issues and you look at simply how these correlate to how much people report of adverse childhood experiences. So just skip down through some of the categories here. Physical abuse, 28.3% reported physical abuse in childhood. Emotional abuse, 10.6%. Sexual abuse, 20.7%. 20.7%. Emotional neglect, almost 15%. Physical neglect, about 10%. And then there's all the household dysfunction, mother treated violently, which is a horrible thing for a child to see, that kind of violence. Household substance abuse, household mental illness, separation or divorce, an incarcerated household member. And here's the really frightening bit of this. The more of these abuse adverse childhood experiences you have, the more damaged, you are, and the more likely you are to fall into things that numb, things that distract. You tend to fall into precisely those categories of self-harm that I was reading a moment ago. And interestingly, 12.5% reported 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And if you have 6, you are 4,600 times more likely to become a drug abuser than somebody with no adverse childhood experiences. So we look at these things and we look at how we're raising our children. We're raising them in environments that are not good environments to raise children in. A lot of them. A lot of these children. I mean, in fact, 36.1% reported no adverse childhood experiences. But almost 2/3 reported at least one, and more than 1 in 5 reported 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. And this is just, your run-of-the-mill domestic horror. This isn't even getting into the some of the larger issues here of sexual violence, and especially sexual violence and what it does to children, what it does to men in particular. Because overwhelmingly, the stats are really interesting on this, overwhelmingly, sexual violence perpetrators, men who rape and assault, had a childhood history of it. But interestingly, not even a large number of men who had been sexually assaulted went on to become perpetrators. It has a lot to do with things like how long the abuse went on, how often it occurred, whether there was any counseling, any stability in their lives that kept it from being this shattering idea, this shattering experience that mitigated it just a touch. But there is this small group. There is this small group of men who perform a great amount of sexual violence. And the numbers, again, if you look at these extrapolations, which are much better than the reported violence, somewhere between 5 and 10 or 12% of men will report some sexually violent behavior, such as rape or assault. And there have just been stacks and stacks of studies done on these for the last 30 years. And the numbers are, in the same ballpark. They're all reasonably consistent. So this tells us that there's this same group of people who keep offending. And Lezak has done some very interesting work on this. He refers to these as undetected rapists because they virtually never get caught because they're very good at what they do. They're very good at what they do. He describes them in this way. This is Lezak. These undetected rapists are extremely adept at identifying likely victims and testing prospective victims' boundaries. So they can smell a victim. They can. Somebody who's damaged, somebody with low self-esteem, somebody who is trying way too hard to please. They can see it, they smell it, And they know how to test the boundaries and see, is this truly my victim? They plan and premeditate their attacks and often use sophisticated strategies to groom their victims and to isolate them physically. Oh, just come in here. They use instrumental violence, but not gratuitous violence. They have really strong impulse control, and they only use violence as much as is needed to terrify and coerce the victims into submission. Instead, they use psychological weapons, power, control, manipulation, threats, backed up by physical force, and almost never resort to weapons such as knives or guns. For good reasons. Knives and guns get the police attention real fast. Oh, he had a gun. He had a knife. Yeah. That gets their cops get guns and knives. They have some problems sometimes with rape. These undetected rapists also use alcohol deliberately to render victims more vulnerable to attack or completely unconscious. And he concludes, in addition, the majority of undetected rapists are serial rapists who also commit, and this is important, who also commit other forms of serious interpersonal violence. In a study of 120 undetected rapists in the Boston area, 63% were serial rapists. These 76 serial rapists were responsible for 439 rapes and attempted rapes, 49 sexual assaults, 277 acts of sexual abuse against children, 66 acts of physical abuse against children, and 214 acts of battery against intimate partners. And these are the guys who don't get caught. They're very good. They're very smooth. Select a victim, interview the victim, groom the victim, isolate the victim, and then use just enough force to coerce the victim into not making a fuss, not fighting back. This is also the same pattern that other forms of predators use. Your classic resource predator might well select a victim, does well, select a victim, interviews the victim. Is this going to be an easy one? Is this going to be a tough one? Can I get close? And then comes in with a sudden attack. And we also see that in process predators, where the act of predation itself is the end. They're not after your money or your car. It's hurting you. That's what we're talking about with these rapists. So, how does all this fit together? So I've been talking about social attitudes. I've been talking about the need to become conscious of pain and damage and the immense amount of pain and damage we have in this culture. So let's see if I'm going to go back to Lysak on this and quote from a 2002 paper of his about the attitudes and beliefs that sexually aggressive men typically have. Sexually aggressive behavior, he writes, is typically part of a belief system that views women as sexual objects to be conquered, coerced, or used for self-gratification. Undetected rapists are much more likely to hold stereotype beliefs about the proper roles for women and men into society and to rigidly adhere to those beliefs. They adhere to rape myths that both justify their aggressive acts and foster them. Their adherence to rape myths and rigid stereotypes frequently allows them to distort their perceptions of the victim's behavior. For example, because they tell themselves that women say no to sex even when they really want it, they can disregard the victim's obvious signs of terror and resistance. Undetected rapists, continuing with Lezak here a little bit, undetected rapists have repeatedly been found to harbor chronic underlying feelings of anger and hostility toward women. Misogyny, in a word. They typically feel easily slighted by women and carry grudges against them. This underlying hostility is easily evoked and colors their distorted perceptions of women as teasers who either secretly want to be coerced into sex or else they deserve it. This sounds to me exactly like the men's rights people, Paul Elam and that crowd. It sound exactly like this, these distorted perceptions of women that constantly shifts between she's just a tease and she needs to be put in her place, or she deserves it. She really wants it. And it's exactly what you hear from these men's rights people. Don't go to their websites, but do visit We Hunted the Mammoth by Paul Futurelle, who does some very good mocking and exposure of these people. But back to the emotions and motivations of these undetected rapists. The men have also consistently been shown to have strong needs to dominate and be in control of women, and to be particularly fearful of being controlled by a woman. This characteristic leads them to view sexual relations as conquests and all women as potential targets of conquests. Undetected rapists have been shown to be more emotionally constricted, more clamped down in their feelings than non-aggressive men. They are less able to label their own emotional experience and much less emotionally expressive. So, again, they're unaware of their feelings. They can't name their feelings. They can't express their feelings. And so they act it out in this rage of attempted control of another person. And it could be a woman, it could be a man, it could be a child, because the crossover is fairly common. If they're doing one, there's a good likelihood that they are doing or have done another. If they've sexually assaulted a woman, they've probably physically or sexually assaulted a child, or both. And they may have sexually assaulted men or physically assaulted men. There's a lot of crossover among these behaviors. So here's an interesting bit. They have been found to harbor, these undetected rapists have been repeatedly found to harbor chronic underlying feelings of hostility toward women. They feel easily slighted and carry grudges against them. So, another bit that is important, and this very much goes to colleges and universities, is the presence of subcultures of sexual violence, subcultures of misogyny, subcultures of hypermasculinity that we see in delinquent gangs, that we see in fraternities, some, that we see in some sports teams. These are extremely powerful forces, and as Lezak says, they both reflect the rapist's views about women and sexual conquest and also help to shape them. For example, at certain college fraternities, the use of violent pornography is a frequent form of entertainment, providing explicit images of rape as being acceptable, non-criminal, and the sign of male virility. Within these subcultures, sexual conquest, having sex with as many women as possible, becomes a critical measure of how men view themselves and each other. The greater the number of such conquests, the more manly he is viewed. The use of coercion and violence to secure those conquests is normalized in the subculture and becomes simply another part of the man's sexual arsenal. It's interesting, too. It is interesting, too, that it's not, they don't feel like they have to impress women. They don't feel like they have to show off to women. They feel like they have to show off to other men. And that in itself is revealing. So, consistent with these rigid views, these undetected rapists, again quoting Lezak, tend to adopt highly gendered identities. They see themselves as hyper-masculine. They're always doing these butch macho things, and lots of pictures of them on their Facebook page with their shirts off, looking all butch. They strive to always behave in rigidly and stereotypically masculine ways. They're always on the alert for any perceived slight to their masculine identities, and they are made very anxious by any situation that might cast doubt on their perceived masculinity. Thus, while in general aggression and violence are perceived to be more masculine than feminine traits, the rapist tends to view aggression and violence as crucial markers of his adequacy as a male. They prove to him that he is a real man. That's how twisted this stuff is. The power motivation that underlies this constant striving for sexual conquest mixes with the rapist's underlying hostility toward women and his hypermasculine identity. When a woman resists his coercive sexual pleasure, he is very likely to perceive this as a challenge and affront to his masculinity and to react with anger and aggression, behaviors which restore his sense of adequacy. So the poor fella is inadequate. He feels inadequate. And if you're raised in a home where you have no supports, where you have violence, where you live in a constant state of fear and terror, where you may be assaulted or see your mother assaulted or your sister assaulted or beaten or killed or raped or whatever as just a matter of course, and that is your world. And you grow up with that inside of you, and you have no idea how to be otherwise. It is your world. One has no idea how to be otherwise growing up in such an environment. And so these very rigid roles maintain a kind of social identity for them. These very rigid gender constructions maintain a kind of identity for them. And to make sure that they feel adequate, whenever they feel inadequate or feel at all threatened, they can always act out and restore, through this cleansing act of violence and assault and rape, restore their sense of adequacy. A couple of other interesting points about these persons. And one is that, again, citing Lezak, I'm going to read a lot of Lezak today, but this will be the last bit. He says, while the traditional view about incarcerated rapists, and these are the ones who get arrested, these are not the ones we're talking about, the undetected ones. The traditional view about incarcerated rapists was that they harbored deep-seated anger toward their mothers. The evidence indicates that among undetected rapists, anger and disappointment about their fathers is far more salient. Anger and disappointment about their fathers is far more salient. For some of these men, damaged relationships with their fathers appears to feed their need to view themselves as hypermasculine and to drive their rigidity and stereotyped beliefs and behaviors. Another developmental factor that has been associated with sexual aggression is child abuse. The rate of child abuse among undetected rapists, particularly childhood physical abuse, is much greater than it is among nonviolent men. And it is good to remember that there are some nonviolent men in the world. I mean, think about it. There's a number of ways we can approach this issue. We have all of these damaged men who have these traumas. And of course, with trauma, you don't really repress it. You keep reliving it. You keep reliving the violence. You keep reliving the horror. It's as Freud wrote in his Beyond the Pleasure Principle. He said, I was wrong. Everything I'd written up to this point is wrong. People do not repress trauma. They relive it constantly. And this is what, of course, we see with PTSD. So why would people not relive their sexual trauma? Why would they not do that? Well, they do. They relive it, and they act it out in a variety of ways. And for some people, until that penny drops for them, if it ever does, this is just how the world is. This is just how it is. We've got almost 700,000 children identified. These are just the ones they counted, right? About 686,000 children identified each year in this country as abused. And there is an appalling lack of services. The few services that are there are so overstretched, so underfunded. Talk to any social worker about his or her caseload. Seriously. The people who work in this are given nothing to address this. And we know for a fact that 2/3 of addiction, for example, 2/3 of addictions are strongly linked to childhood sexual abuse. We know that sexual assault is strongly linked to becoming damaged, and multiple sexual assaults that aren't treated create perpetrators, create predators. So these feelings of powerlessness and anger and I'm not a real man. I've got to act out. I've got to act out. These are motivational factors. So, I was talking earlier about the crossover offending. 33 to 66%, depending on whose numbers you look at, of rapists, of men who raped women, also sexually attacked children. Up to 82%. Up to 82% of sexually attacked children. Yeah, up to 82% of child molesters have sexually attacked adults. All right, so we've got rapists attacking children and child molesters attacking adults. It's the same people. It's the same small group. It's this, 4, 5, 6% of chronically damaged men, but who are supported by a bunch of men who should know better. Who should know better than to create and support environments where these people thrive, where they get their reinforcement. Yeah, let's go out and do all this macho craziness. I mean, the guys who do have enough consciousness to address that really need to be about this. I'm going to save a little time to talk about that at the end of the show. 50 to 60% of incest offenders also attack children outside their families. So, we got three big problems here, right? And they're all about men. Or I'm going to make them all about men. The first is we have an enormous problem with childhood abuse and neglect. On no reasonable standard are we doing well as a culture, and we should be shamed. We should weep over the numbers of childhood abuse and neglect in this country. We have a small number of serial perpetrators who cross over categories of offense, and we have a culture of men who have some level of misogyny toward women, and who likely also have some measure of anger and resentment and feeling of powerlessness toward the world. We failed miserably at almost every significant support toward developing healthy, non-rapey men, and a culture which doesn't terrify its women, but empowers them. It all goes back to childhood. It all goes back to childhood, how we raise our children. But for a lot of men, the damage is done. A lot of damage is done. And the question is, what now? Well, as I opened the piece with the necessity of reflecting, of building an ethics of one's thoughts and one's actions, this is where I want to go. Therapy is one way. It's a good start. Therapy is a good start, but therapy that's not followed up with one's own building of a hexis of decent behavior is going to be a Band-Aid. Because finally, men must create for themselves a reflection on their own thoughts and feelings, and the ways in which these are manifested in fantasy and in interaction, and in what kind of porn you're looking at, and why are you looking at that particular one, and what does it say to you? What is the fantasy playing here? And having the courage, you want to talk about courage, having the courage to follow that rabbit hole and see where it goes. Yeah, I'm so sick of bloody men who go on and on and on about how they don't want to talk about their feelings. They block every avenue toward healing themselves and toward nurturing the generations of men to come. Men have to learn to make allies of each other in this. Men have to learn how to make allies of the people they love in this endeavor, especially women. You know, as a survivor of childhood sexual violence, as a survivor of other kinds of violence in my world, I ask all of my brothers and sisters, to take all those experiences that they've had in the world and to talk about them. Let's quit being shamed. Let's quit being afraid. Let's talk about this like this is the elephant in the room, because indeed it is. And we must be able to speak plainly about what we have experienced. Move beyond guilt and shame, and for heaven's sakes, move beyond acting out. Only thus do we become conscious. And only by becoming conscious do we become truly human. By which I mean, we are responsible for our actions as moral beings. We are aware of our own journey through pain and the discovery that's on the other side of that journey. And only by being conscious, by becoming conscious, can we truly find the love and the peace that we seek. And this concludes today's show. You've been listening to Long Waves with Gary Krug at KYRS, and we are broadcasting on KYRS Medical Lake and Spokane, 88.1 and 92.3 FM. You can email me, longwaves@kyrs.org. You can hear podcasts of the show on YouTube. Just search on YouTube, put it in quotes, the entire phrase Long Waves Radio. Pop you right up. You can also find me on Facebook, the same name, Long Waves Radio. I look forward to hearing from you. I thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me again next week. Until then, work on getting conscious. We got some work to do. Bye-bye.